Recollect. Duke? Welcome back to the Petra Pan Apparel YouTube channel, a place where we celebrate women through fashion history, and today is all about fashion history because we are going to continue the story of Elsa Schiaparelli. In the last video we left off right leading up to World War II, and we spoke mostly about her earlier life. In this video I'm going to be focusing on more about her collections and her life during the war. In researching for this video it was quite an undertaking because it was really difficult to find any chronological information, particularly about her collections. So I went through archives of all different newspapers, magazines, looking for the key terms of what she actually named her collections, because she uniquely at the time did thematic collections. I was able to kind of piece together a chronological view of the collections that Schiaparelli released all around the time of World War II. The first collection mentioned in her autobiography is the Stop, Look and Listen collection, and this is the collection where she famously includes the newspaper print to celebrate her success. So she had newspaper clippings from all over the world put into this textile that she had in this collection. And in the year before, she had introduced this kind of glass transparent textile that she also used in this 1935 collection, as well as the newspaper print. And in the year 1935, in all of this kind of research I was doing, the big trends at the time were this kind of Middle Eastern influence, and you're starting to see this type of harem pant, which you often see women in the 30s, because it was still not really considered appropriate for women to be wearing trousers, as it was a masculine garment. So rather than that, they used this kind of exotic Middle East influence to kind of make it less of a masculine statement for women to be wearing pants, even though they're pretty much the same garment. There was a lot of drapery, starting to look to other cultures for inspiration. Now, the next big event that happens in the House of Schiaparelli is the release of her perfume. Now, her perfume and cosmetics company actually was set up as a different company, which really served Schiaparelli well later in her life. So her perfume, Shocking, came out in 1937, and the story famously goes that Mae West had ordered a dress to be made by Schiaparelli, and since she couldn't actually be in Paris, she had a bust cast of her entire upper body. And Mae West was a notoriously curvy, beautiful actress of the time, and so basically this cast of Mae West's body became the inspiration for Schiaparelli's bottle of perfume, Shocking. And it should look a little bit familiar, very much resembling another perfume that is quite well known today. She was certainly not the first to think of this idea. Now, by 1938, Elsa Schiaparelli was already really well known, and she had become very famous, especially for her dinner jackets. Now, a lot of her clients were still wearing these black dresses and severe suits, but her dinner jackets were basically these blazers that were just highly ornamented, and she had become quite well known for this particular style of garment. So for all these collections, in Vogue magazines, basically the American Vogue magazines, which is what I have access to, you would have reporters in France sending back sketches for all of when the collections were first released, and then you wouldn't see actual photographs of the garments until the following edition, which was 2 weeks later. So you get a lot of these really exciting sketches of the garments followed by the actual photographs of the garments. And so Schiaparelli's garments were often sketched in these very fantastical kind of settings, and then we would see photographs in the following edition. And once we hit 1938 and 1939, you start to see a shift. There's a slow build towards color photography, but it also starts to dip down a little bit at this time. But also keep in mind, in 1938, the kind of first rumblings of World War II are beginning, so there's a little bit of unrest and uncertainty about what's going to be happening in the future. So the 1938 spring collection was the Circus collection, and this collection does not need very much introduction. This was kind of known as a little bit of a last hurrah before the war, this kind of carefree, colorful collection of circus iconography. There were elephants, there were acrobats, and actually her Her fashion show for the Circus collection was widely reported and people loved it. There was a lot of spectacle involved, actual circus performers. You see this written about in all kinds of newspapers, all across Vogue magazine as well. And then towards the end of 1938, moving into I believe it's fall 1938, you had the Pagan collection, which was kind of a more naturalistic, inspired by nature and a lot of florals, a lot of natural elements in this collection. But it was really hard to find published information about this collection because we are starting to get so close to World War II. I think there wasn't as much publicized about this collection. She also released an undergarment. By the same Duke. But at the same time, she did come out with an undergarment by the same name of Pagan, and there are a lot of advertisements for this undergarment, and I think it was a similar endeavor to the Perfume, where she's licensing out her name to market this undergarment. So it was a girdle that went over the hips to control the form of the body, so that you would have all these smooth lines underneath, the type of garments that were created for the Pagan collection, which were a lot more flowing, drapey, and natural forms. The next really big name collection that comes along is her Zodiac collection, and Schiaparelli is incredibly famous for this Zodiac collection. It's really well known, and you can find a lot of beautiful garments from this collection. So Schiaparelli, as we know, had a famous uncle who was a great astronomer, and told her when she was young that she had the constellation of the Great Bear on her cheek, or the Big Dipper on her cheek. So this is a motif that she uses a lot in her clothing. And so in the Zodiac collection, also called the Astrology collection, she uses, of course, a lot of beautiful stars and astrological symbols all throughout this collection. And in the collection, you will see the sort of silhouette in a lot of, especially the jackets and the suits, are this kind of nipped in waist silhouette that we do see later on with the new look as we start to get it to the end of the 40s. And we'll get back to that later on because she definitely has some thoughts towards the end of the 40s about that silhouette. And she begins showing a lot of these needle skirts, which are maybe something we would call today like a wiggle skirt or a pencil skirt, or a really fitted type of skirt, maybe kind of in a way preempting the fabric rationing that was about to be happening. I found publications talking about some of the prints that she showed in some of these collections, which included things like trumpets, penguins, sailor hats, mice, and all kinds of fun, lively things. So she was kind of known throughout these publications for bringing something different to the Paris collections. I also found reference to a winter collection inspired by Harlequin dress, which I hadn't seen referenced in anything else. The reports all talk about all the masks that she was wearing, and I even saw reference to these masks, Harlequin kind of masks, in other collections in later years. People really seem to remember these masks. And interestingly, there was a costume designed by Givenchy, who actually worked for Schiaparelli until he started his own house in 1952. But there is a famous costume that he designed, a Harlequin costume for a costume ball or a fancy dress ball, designed in an incredibly similar way to her earlier Harlequin collection, which I had not seen referenced. So moving into 1939, we see her music collection, which is another really well-known collection. And this collection was really special in that it had actual music boxes and little instruments incorporated into various garments and accessories. So she had belts that had music boxes built in. She had a handbag that had a little piano keyboard on it that would play a certain tune. She had music notes on gloves and dresses and hats. Hi. Are you coming in? Duke has a no closed door policy in our house. Thanks, bud. Thanks. Yeah, you can go now. Okay, go ahead. Duke! Can you just leave the door shut, please? It cannot latch the door because if you've seen it in my previous videos, if the door in here gets latched, I get locked in and I have to climb out the window. Here's the little intruder. Dukey. Duke. Oh, hello. Okay. Back to work. Dude, my battery is gonna die. Are you gonna stay here? Oh. Rude. So as we move later into 1939, we're getting closer and closer to the official onset of World War II, and sadly, Schiaparelli is heartbroken when it is discovered that one of the girls working in her shop is a spy, which had been a great cause of some of the trouble that she had faced before and would face later, especially due to Schiaparelli's Italian heritage. So sadly, she had to tell the girl that she had 3 days to get out of France, and the girl who Schiaparelli loved denied it incessantly, but the house of Schiaparelli was put into too much danger by her being there. Her great big Italian heart was thrown into even more turmoil once the war had been declared and Mussolini aligned himself with Hitler to declare war on France. So in September 1939, war was officially declared and everyone prepared for a quick and savage bombardment, as Schiaparelli says. People were carrying gas masks, preparing for air raids. But this time period was known as the Phony Wars, which was from about September of 1939 to May 1940, where everyone was expecting this huge explosion of war, but actually there was very little military activity until May of 1940. So during this time, the fashion industry continued to operate in Paris. Schiaparelli's next collection was the Cash and Carry collection. Duke? Now, I was incredibly proud of my research on this collection because I only ever found reference to it in her autobiography, Shocking Life, and I could never find any images about this collection until I found one Washington Post article that talked about the Cash and Carry collection. The dresses had large pockets so that women could carry anything they needed to when they were off to service work or had to run to the air raid shelter. It also included a dress that could transform from a day dress to a night dress, a day dress to an evening dress by letting out the skirt by a ribbon, so the skirt would drop down sort of like a curtain. So as the war progressed and the Germans moved closer and closer to occupying Paris, the couturiers of Paris all sort of started meeting together to discuss what they were going to do. So there was a lot of discussion of moving their operations to another town called Biarritz, where a man called Captain Molyneux had a house. Schiaparelli's not really clear about the connection of this man to the couture group, but they decided that they were going to move some of their equipment and staff out to Biarritz so that they would hopefully be away from German influence and would be able to continue operations as normal. But it was quickly discovered this was not going to be the case. However, there was a last-ditch effort in June 1940 to release their mid-season collections, and if you look, there's actually a spread in Vogue, a 4-page spread where most of the photographs are actually taken from Captain Molyneux's house in Biarritz, and even says where the photographs were taken. So from this point on, this is where we really start to see the decline of fashions coming out of occupied Paris. So around this time, Schiaparelli decided that she was going to travel to America to honor a commitment that she had made to do a series of lectures across the country. So she made a mad dash to get out just as the Germans were moving into Paris. And her most beloved mannequin from the window, Pascal, was sent ahead of her to San Francisco, where he stayed dressed in patriotic colors. He would receive a new copy of the French newspaper every day and served as kind of an ambassador between France and the States. She spent a lot of time in New York trying to bolster relations between the US and the French and really raise awareness of kind of what was going on. So she raised a lot of money and collected donations of vitamins and supplies to take back to children in unoccupied France. And at the end of her tour, to the shock of many people, she decided to go back, even though this was a potentially dangerous decision. So she got on a boat with all of her cargo to head back to Paris. With all of her cargo, even after receiving the proper permits, she was stopped in Bermuda, and an officer who had taken over for his superior for the day seized all of her cargo and refused to send them on, which is likely because the Germans were occupying Paris, so in his eyes these supplies may have been going to the Germans in Paris, and because of Elsa Schiaparelli's Italian heritage, people were often a little bit dubious of her. Elsa pleaded with the man for hours to no avail, and even after telling him that the items were perishable and had been donated by the Quakers, he still refused to send the cargo on. So she quickly wrote a note on one of the permits that if these supplies could not be delivered to the children in unoccupied France, that they be taken to the children of England. And 2 weeks later, when she arrived in Europe, a reporter jumped on the ship and asked her, Elsa, so what about the vitamins, what about the supplies? And it turned out that, back in the States, Hoover was furious about this because the Germans had learned of the story and were using these reports in their propaganda against the Allied nations. So needless to say, all the supplies were brought hastily and unquestioningly from Bermuda to France. But even after arriving in Europe, she had a lot of trouble crossing the border into France, so she had to spend about a month working all of her networks and her contacts to try to get back into the country. Finally, during the night, she was able to secure herself a visa and travel quickly into France, but in her hurry, she forgot her hat, which doesn't sound very important, but inside this hat, she had sewn thousands of dollars that Americans had sent with her to take to their families in France that had become destitute from the war. And she was guilt-ridden that she had got back to France without this hat. But of course, as Elsa Schiaparelli's luck would have it, a woman who she knew walked into her shop one day wearing the hat which she had rescued and hoping that Schiaparelli was going to allow her to keep it. So Scap ran into the other room, ripped the money out of the hat, and brought back the hat and joyously gave it to her friend. Elsa Schiaparelli returned to a German-occupied France, and she said when she arrived on the train and heard the station name read out in German, it was absolutely heartbreaking, and she felt like it was really couldn't believe that it was happening. So the French couture industry was under a lot of scrutiny from other countries because during the war, under German occupation, they continued to operate and sell clothing to Germans, especially German officers buying clothing for their wives. And their primary clientele became, obviously, German. So a lot of people were really skeptical that France and French couturiers were working for the Germans, but Elsa Schiaparelli defends them by saying that, quote, the French were working to keep themselves and their families and their country alive. If they had stopped everything and if Germany had turned France into a vast cemetery, what good would that have done? Either you kept the door of your business open or you threw people out of work. So during this time of occupation, French fashion was rebelliously outrageous. So women were wearing massive shoulders, slim waists, short skirts, wild hair, and ridiculous hats, or hideous headgear, as Schiaparelli describes it. But even she recognized that, quote, in order to defend its real inner self, France put up a front that purposely skirted on the edge of ridicule. And the Dressed podcast has a really excellent episode all about French ridiculous wild fashion during the German occupation, which I will link in the description box. So as the war progressed on, Schiaparelli decided to return back to America because her daughter Gogo, if you remember, when she was a child, chose American citizenship. So at the outset of the war, Americans were required to return back to the States, and so Schiaparelli had really encouraged Gogo to return to the States. And at the time, she had met a man, and then when Schiaparelli had returned from her last trip to New York, Gogo had got married. So Schiaparelli decided to go back to the States to be with Gogo at this time because her couture house was operating, but just barely. So she goes back to New York City, but she's living amongst all these high society circles in the States, which hadn't really been affected yet by the war, and she was growing increasingly restless and unhappy until she decided to join the American Red Cross to become a nurse's aide. And she describes her experience as, quote, washing bodies of different races and different colors, sometimes diseased to the last degree, listening to endless stories, swamped in organic smells. All this made her feel a part of humanity again, and no longer a dead branch hurled by the hurricane. It saved her soul. And of course, Elsa Schiaparelli is talking about herself, which she often does in the third person in her autobiography. So of course, when the US joined the war in 1941, Schiaparelli was still living in New York City, and Gogo's husband, her son-in-law, quickly volunteered and was sent off to North Africa. So Gogo, like many other wartime brides, Gogo also volunteered with the American Red Cross for service overseas, meaning Schiaparelli was living on her own between Washington, D.C. and New York City, often staying with friends for most of the duration of the rest of the war. She wasn't designing any clothing at this time. Clothing didn't really even enter her mind until after the end of the war, but she was spending a lot of her time doing more of this fundraising and campaigning for aid to be sent to France. And when word finally came that Paris had been freed from German occupation, she was actually invited with 2 other Frenchmen to meet President Roosevelt the day before the autonomy of France was recognized by the US. So then Schiap returns to Paris and finds her grateful and wonderful staff still mostly intact in her Place Vendôme studio. They begin working again. And Schiaparelli is eager to get rid of these ridiculous, necessary at the time, fashions of occupied France. She has her own new look in mind with what she describes as long drooped shoulders, long dresses, and a raised bust. And she said it's kind of a return to Regency. Sound familiar? And of course, at this time, we get to 1947 at the end of the war with Dior's new look, and Schiaparelli has some things to say about this. Quote, "This brings me to 1947, the tolling of the bell, when the new look, cleverly planned and magnificently financed, achieved to the greatest din of publicity ever known, the shortest life of any fashion in history." So she was not exactly keen on the new look, and a lot of people weren't. So during the war, women had grown accustomed to wearing these really practical fashions, and as they sort of infiltrated the workplace and found this really empowering, so a lot of women, when we go back to this corseted waist, long skirts, were really against this fashion. There was even a club called the Little Below the Knee Club, and they didn't want to go back to these long skirts of their grandmothers. And Elizabeth Hawes, who's an American designer at the time, talks about how in the French fashion industry, a lot of these couture houses are basically owned by French fabric manufacturing. So she kind of views this as a way of the French manufacturing industry kind of calling in all their debts and being like, hey, look, everybody, we're going to use as much fabric as possible. But of course, some people were really relieved and happy to have these styles post clothing rationing of the war. So sadly, after World War II, Schiaparelli's house never really fully recovers to its previous glory that it had at the cusp of World War II. She continues to release collections, and as I said, Givenchy comes on board to work for her house. He departs in 1952, and they didn't end on good terms, and then in 1954, Schiaparelli decides to close her fashion house. However, her perfume line continued on, as it was a separate business. And fascinatingly, Schiaparelli's house, the archive and copyrights were acquired in 2006, and then in 2012, the house was reopened, and they have been releasing some really fabulous, wonderful collections with really clear and obvious nods to the original designs of Elsa Schiaparelli. So what has Elsa Schiaparelli contributed to the fashion world today? In my opinion, one of the biggest influence that she has had on today's fashion are some of her surrealist influences, which we see a lot reflected in clothing today. She pushed a lot of boundaries that people would edge towards slowly later on, and to me, she really brought a lot of fun to fashion that we hadn't seen in this kind of way before her designs. She challenged a lot of the structures that had been in place for such a long time, and her love of the absurd. Who else was gonna put a shoe on someone's head as a hat? What more do I need to say? Thank you so much for watching this, and there is so much more about Elsa Schiaparelli that I would love to be able to talk about. She was such an incredible woman. If you'd like to learn more, I'm going to leave some links to some different resources and books, and also a list of citations used in this video. And of course, I highly recommend picking up a copy of her autobiography, Shocking Life. It's incredibly easy to read. It's really enjoyable. Because it is Elsa Schiaparelli writing about herself, I feel like it gives us incredibly good insight into her thought process and ideas. So thank you so much for joining me on this second installment of the Elsa Schiaparelli designer profile. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe, and let me know in the comments which other designers would you like to see profiled in this series. Again, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye!